The bar does not care about your spreadsheet. Strength training has evolved past percentages, and that's where these come into play. Welcome back to another athletic resilience video. My name is Kyle. I'm the founder of Athletic Resilience, and I'm a strength coach as well as a physical therapist. If you have not been here before, thank you for joining, and I hope you enjoy the video. In today's video, I'm going to break down what VBT is, go over a brief history of where it came from, talk about how you can best utilize VBT as part of your training, talk about how to incorporate it for the purposes of autoregulation, and saving the best for last, at the end of the video, there will be a live demonstration of how to set up and use one of these units. So before I even get to the history, I'm going to address the one main point that most people are going to bring up, which is why would I stop using percentages when I have been using percentages the entire time I have been lifting? And I get it. On paper, using percentages makes sense. You're pulling a number directly from a maximal lift that you've already done, which means it should be accurate, right? Wrong. Percentages are old school and completely ignore the fact that on a day-to-day basis, your nervous system and how capable it is of outputting for you fluctuates wildly. We are talking a minimum of at least 10% above or below what we would call your kind of main resting threshold. Those fluctuations in nervous system function come about due to changes in your sleep, your stress, your nutrition, your recovery, and can even be based on when in the day you are lifting. The reality is 80% is not always 80%, even if that's what's written on the paper. Your 80% one day could be 90, could be 95, or it could be 70 or 65. And that is why VBT is so important. Using a velocity unit allows you to recognize when you are likely going to under or overtrain relative to what you would have expected when you walked into the gym that day. All right, so let's cover that quick history lesson. VBT, at least conceptually, has been around for a long time. We are talking the 60s or the 70s here. Obviously, in its original iterations, it was fairly inaccurate. We're literally talking coaches sitting there trying to analyze video with a stopwatch, but the concept was there. They were already locked in on the fact that that correlation between speed and load was a proxy for estimating intensity for that movement for that athlete. But it took until about the 90s for researchers to start running controlled tests that correlated bar velocities directly with athletes' 1 repetition maximums for specific lifts. Around this same time period and kind of rolling into the early 2000s is when the first units really started to roll out. The one I was first introduced to as a coach in a collegiate setting was a Tendo unit. Nowadays, the technology has just gotten better, the units have gotten smaller, and there are more and more companies bringing products to the market. That has been great because that has dropped the price of some of these units, and it's allowed them to go from exclusively being utilized in elite sports performance to now people, like me, having them at home. On the whole, the units can be broken down into a couple different categories. We have linear position transducers, which is just a fancy name for a device that has a string that attaches to the bar, and it reads the velocity based on how much of the string is pulled out of the unit and the speed at which that string is pulled. And now that technology has progressed, units tend to fall more in the categories of accelerometers, inertial measurement units, or even now we've got camera-based units that can be anchored overhead off of things like a squat rack and can look down at an entire platform and are taking measurements that way. What these new styles of units have freed up is the ability to start to measure movements that aren't just barbell related. This is because the unit doesn't have to be anchored to something that's metal, which means we can now start to incorporate velocity tracking into other plyometric movements that don't use weights. Box jumps, counter movement jumps, broad jumps. I mean, you name it, there is a way now to be able to track the velocity of these movements because of how far technology has progressed. But the principle remains the same. Movement speed is one of the most reliable ways to assess how ready your body is to train and objectively provides output data in front of you to guide your training in the moment. So velocity-based training is a little bit of a rabbit hole, I'll be honest. But what we'll cover today will absolutely allow you to incorporate it almost to the fullest extent possible by the end of the video. VBT is exactly what it sounds like. It is the tracking of the velocity of a movement, and in most cases, it is related to barbell-based movements. Typically, what VBT is assessing is concentric velocity, typically what is known as the hard part of a movement. Now, depending on the training cycle and kind of what training competency is being emphasized in that training cycle, you could be looking at eccentric velocities, especially if you are running an eccentric heavy block. But if you were to look this up on YouTube or on Google, 9 times out of 10, when someone's discussing this, they are talking about the use and the measurement of concentric velocity, not eccentric. There are a multitude of aspects of concentric velocity that can be measured and utilized from a programming perspective. However, on the whole, the 3 things that are typically looked at are average or mean concentric velocity, peak concentric velocity, and velocity loss. Mean and peak velocities are exactly like what they sound like. You are either looking at the mean velocity either for a rep or for a whole set, or you are looking at the peak velocity either for a rep or a whole set. Velocity loss is an interesting one. We are looking at the average or mean velocity loss over the course of a whole set from rep 1 to rep 5. If velocity loss is being tracked, it's typically being utilized to actually cut a set off at a pre-specified velocity loss as determined by the coach, whether that's 10%, 15%, 20%, 25%. And then the units will track the velocity loss from rep 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. And you'll know, boom, velocity loss number is right in front of my face. Once I hit the predetermined number set out for me by the coach, set's over. Now, can these units track more than just velocity? Absolutely. Technology's crazy, it has evolved, and at this point in time, these units are now tracking movement range of motion, which is awesome depending on the movement being performed. A lot of them can track in 3D, which means they are great at analyzing or assessing bar path. But all that being said, the primary endpoint, the primary metric being tracked still remains velocity. So before we jump into how to use velocity units as part of your training, there is a quick aside that we need to discuss. If you are training for hypertrophy, i.e. you are trying to put size on, velocity is not worth pursuing. And there's one main reason for why that's the case. Hypertrophy is driven by volume and proximity to failure and can be achieved across a large rep range. That means that if you get the stimulus right on a week-to-week basis and you are getting enough volume per muscle group per week, and the intensity of those sets, think RIR, RPE here, are high enough and your proximity to failure is close enough, and you train in this way for long enough, you will put muscle mass on. However, when we're trying to put muscle mass on, movement speed is not the important part. The important part is the volume and the intensity, even if you're doing compound movements as part of your hypertrophy training. However, once we start talking about sports performance, or even more direct competitive barbell sports, Olympic weightlifting, powerlifting, and certain aspects of CrossFit, movement speed becomes paramount. In almost all sports, especially the barbell sports, strength and power are the primary determinant of ultimate performance. Because that's the case, velocity and load intensity become your most relevant training metrics. And that is why velocity-based training in that population becomes incredibly important. To best explain how you can incorporate velocity into your own training, we are going to break down velocity zones that correlate to different training emphases, so that based on what you're trying to achieve with your own training, you can understand where along the velocity spectrum most of your work is going to fall. One important note here before we dive into these velocity zones, and that is that these are guidelines, not absolutes. The reality is some athletes are going to be better at moving heavier stuff slowly, and some athletes are going to be better at moving lighter stuff more quickly. These distinctions should be fairly obvious in that these athletes should have excelled in very different sports. Powerlifters who are great at moving very heavy shit slowly are not necessarily the best weightlifters, because those athletes are moving sub-maximal weights around because the clean and jerk and the snatch are derivative or relative movements of a bigger, heavier compound movement. So with that reality in mind, we need to recognize that not all athletes are going to move the same percentage or the same intensity of loads at similar speeds. So you need to be able to recognize and understand, either A, as an athlete, or B, as a coach, when you have someone or you are someone that's operating kind of outside of the bounds and the guidelines that are considered normal, and just accept that that's okay. And that might actually help guide your training moving forward. If you're someone who moves really heavy things slowly well, but you're not good on the upper end of the spectrum, maybe part of your training time should be invested in moving slightly lighter stuff a little bit more quickly. And vice versa, if you're the really jumpy, springy one, and you can move things incredibly quickly, but the second the loads start to get a little bit on the heavier side, and we're working our way down into quads, triples, doubles, and suddenly everything starts to stall out for you and you hate that style of training, that's probably what you need to emphasize in your training moving forward until you make the weakest link in your chain stronger. So let's dive into the velocity zones, slowest to fastest. The slowest velocity zone we're gonna have is max strength. There are different terms that can be utilized, so don't get hung up on the absolute terminology. What I want you to recognize, and what's most important, is that from a velocity perspective, this style of training is happening under 0.5 meters per second. And I am talking, in this specific scenario, mean concentric velocity. Training that's happening in this velocity zone is your hard, heavy, slow work. We're not throwing a ton of volume at this. This is approaching near maximal effort. On the whole, 0.5 meters per second tends to correlate with roughly 80% of a 1 rep max for some of your main movements. Depending on the movement in question though, sometimes these speeds and the percentage maximums are gonna be different. Bench press, for example, if you're attempting a heavy single approaching a near maximal attempt, is going to have a slower mean concentric velocity than a back squat would at the same intensity. So depending on the sport in question, you may be spending a large portion of your training time kind of inside this zone, or this may be a zone you kind of dabble in as opposed to one that you are spending the majority of your training time inside of. Next up is the velocity zone called strength speed. This tends to incorporate the 0.5 to 1.0 meter per second range. The goal at these speeds is to move relatively heavy weights as quickly as humanly possible. If you're looking at strength training on the whole for most athletes, this is the zone where most of your working sets are going to be performed. This zone of 0.5 to 1.0 meters per second tends to correlate with roughly 60 to 80% of an athlete's 1 repetition maximum for any given movement. The amount of correlation in the actual percentages are going to differ a little bit from movement to movement. Again, if we're comparing something like a back squat to a deadlift, to a push press, or to a strict press, or to a bench press, even if those movements were performed at a similar relative percentage of an athlete's 1 repetition max. Now, I think an aside here is necessary because this category is typically the one where I see the most confusion, and it is purely based on definitions. So ironically, in all circumstances, the way that I've seen this presented, everyone is right. It's just based on the angle at which they're looking at this topic. What you may see if you went and found a chart on Google is a category called accelerative strength. Now, sometimes this is put in or around this block, and sometimes it's put all the way at the end of the spectrum, kind of where you would find your max speed work. The reason that that's happening is based on the context. In its original sports science context, we are talking the old school Soviet bloc era Russian literature and scientific research. Accelerative strength was the ability to keep accelerating a load once it was already moving, and was typically measured in peak velocity, which put it squarely at the fastest end of the spectrum. But if we're talking about things in more of a modern barbell training context, accelerative strength is often looked at in terms of mean velocities, which shifts it from the far end of the spectrum down somewhere in between our max strength section and our strength speed section. And that's because the correlated mean velocity for the same movement moved at a 1.1 to 1.3 meters per second peak velocity is going to be somewhere in that 0.7 to 0.9 mean velocity range. So when you see it presented or hear it discussed, neither is wrong. They're both just contextually different, and you need to understand who's presenting it and how they're contextualizing that information to understand the way that it's being spoken about. Now, third up on the list is going to be speed strength. We're now sitting somewhere between a 1.0 and roughly a 1.3 meters per second mean velocity. In this range, the focus flips. Now, instead of trying to move relatively heavy loads quickly, we are trying to move much lighter loads as fast as humanly possible. This is typically going to correlate with loads that are sitting somewhere between 30 and 50% of an athlete's 1 rep max for any given movement. Now, an important caveat in this velocity zone is that 30 to 50% of an athlete's 1 rep max range is going to be very dependent on the movement in question. You need to consider whether the movement being trained is an absolute movement or a relative or derivative movement. What I mean here is if you're looking to work on a back squat in this speed range, so this 1 to 1.3 range, that 30 to 50% ballpark is going to roughly be accurate. However, if you're looking to train a clean and jerk or a snatch or a push press or something of that nature inside of this range, the actual correlated percentage is going to be much higher because the movement itself is relative or derivative off of an absolute movement. Your clean is going to be a number relative to your strength in the front squat. Your snatch is relative, typically, to your strength in the back squat and the overhead squat. So if we're talking absolute movements, that 30 to 50 is pretty accurate. But if we're talking some of those relative or derivative movements, your correlated 1 rep max percentage category is going to be higher. It's probably going to be somewhere more in like the 60 to 70-ish ballpark. And finally, our last category is going to be max speed. This is happening at mean velocities above 1.3 meters per second. These are typically unloaded or lightly loaded ballistic movements. The emphasis here is on maximum movement speed and being as explosive as humanly possible. Now that we're done talking about the velocity zones, we can have a conversation about how the velocity units factor in and help with autoregulation. I think there are two primary ways that velocity-based training can help with autoregulation, and thankfully the first is inherently baked into the process. Assuming that your athletes have their lifestyles fairly well managed, which means stress is low, sleep is high in quality and in volume, and nutrition is fairly dialed, as long as you are programming appropriate volume for the speeds you are asking, it is impossible for your athletes to either over or under train if they are abiding by the speeds. If they are not honest about their speeds and they are either over or under shooting, it doesn't matter how good your programming is at all. But if they are truly being honest and they are taking weight off when they are missing speeds and they are putting weight on when they're way above, then you should have a fairly foolproof system inherently built in just by using the velocity units. Now, they can also be utilized to help guide training decisions day of. In order to do this accurately, you will have to have load velocity profiled that athlete for the specific movement. Load velocity profiling involves getting speeds for your athlete for the movement in question at relative percentages of their 1 rep max, which means you would start that protocol somewhere between 10 and 15% of their 1 rep max, and then work your way all the way to a maximal effort. What that's going to allow you to do is come up with a speed that's associated with each 10 percentage break of their 1 repetition maximum. You should be going into the load velocity profiling with speed brackets or expectations at each given percentage of their 1 repetition maximum. If the athlete falls outside of that bracket or those expectations, that lets you know that in that area, from a velocity perspective, they are not good at applying or producing force. That can then help guide your programming for that athlete moving forward and ensure that you rectify areas or zones where they don't produce force efficiently. And having those numbers from the load velocity profile also allows you to test on a given day whether or not some of your programming needs to change. If an athlete was coming in and you had programmed front squats for the day and you have a load velocity profile for that athlete for the front squat, you can give them a set or 2 of warm-ups at a specific percentage of their 1 repetition maximum with the expectation that that should be moving at a given speed that you have already taken down through the profiling. If the athlete is wildly above that speed at that load, that lets you know that their central nervous system is firing on all cylinders, and you may want to change how you are going about training them that day to capitalize on the fact that their nervous system is ready to be hit with a fairly large stimulus. On the flip side, if that athlete is taking your warm-up weight and moving it incredibly slowly relative to what they did during the load velocity profiling, you know that their central nervous system is underperforming for the day, and you likely have to make adjustments to the training to make sure that you don't overtrain them or start to at least nudge them in the direction of overtraining with a stimulus that they're not ready to handle. But I do want to reiterate, you do not have to go through the load velocity profiling to gain the benefits of using the velocity units. It's a helpful additive, and it's something in certain circumstances and with the right athlete pool and with the right movements, it's something that becomes beneficial and relevant. But for other individuals, just having access to the VBT might be all that you need to make sure that your training is consistently optimized and to give you the best possible chance, assuming that lifestyle is not always going to be something that is completely addressable. It is going to give you the best possible chance to avoid both over and under training, because it is providing objective data so that you are not guessing anytime you're in the gym. So now that we've covered the background, the history, why it's important, kind of the conceptuals, let's go check out actually how to utilize it in a live demo. I happen to have a rep 1. These units are linear position transducers, which means there is a string, then there is a piece at the end that is magnetized, and that is the part that gets anchored to the barbell. And then this happens to have a magnetized base. I typically anchor that off onto the squat rack itself. That holds it in place. It does not matter where on the barbell this piece goes. Obviously, you might need to make a little bit of a judgment call based on the movement that you're performing and kind of like where your hand placement needs to be on the barbell itself. So in certain circumstances, I will attach this literally to the barbell. And then in other circumstances, I will attach it to the sleeve based on the movement that is being performed. So let's go check it out. So here we have our barbell set up. I'm just going to anchor this onto the squat rack. This piece comes out, gets attached to the barbell itself. And now it's as easy as just picking the barbell up. So I'll typically set up an iPad in front of the athlete whenever they're performing the movement so that they have the visual cue of knowing what their velocities are throughout the course of their set. The one thing that I have not covered yet in everything that we've talked about in this video is the fact that velocity units and being able to visually, as an athlete, see the speed at which you are moving a barbell or an implement is one of the most motivating things on the face of the planet. My girlfriend loves to use the velocity unit. The program that I've written for her over the past 4 or 5 months or so has consistently had 1 to 2 movements per day that are on the velocity unit. She's been absolutely dumbfounded by the weights that she has been moving and what she's had to put on the bar to get to those velocities that I programmed relative to what she would have put on the bar intuitively if I'd given her an RIR to aim for as opposed to a speed. It is also incredible to use in group settings. So if you've got a weight room full of people and you've got 2, 3, 4 athletes to a rack or a platform, and they're deadlifting, they're back squatting, they're front squatting, whatever they happen to be doing, they're cleaning, there is something to be said for having the visual of every one of those athletes' speeds for each of their sets up in front of the group. I think you would be shocked that there is likely even more competitiveness in those athletes when you actually put something visual that they can match against their peers in front of them. And even in settings that aren't a high school or collegiate weight room, but are a more strength-focused adult kind of weekend warrior, ex-collegiate athlete, and I'm still lifting into adulthood type of class, I think you would be surprised how practical and fun using velocity units can be for those group classes. Even in those settings, using velocity units can be a great way to drive a little bit of competitiveness between the people that are coming in to work out together. People love that. It's also awesome to have something that draws people's focus outside of themselves. This has been studied time and time and time again. If we draw our athletes' focus outside of themselves, outside of joints and position and all of those more intrinsically focused cues, and we put it on something external to them, force output, power output always goes up. People are able to express more of their latent natural athleticism, speed, power, strength, etc. when they are not focusing on the specifics of where their knees are at, their hips are at, their back is at, but they're just thinking, holy shit, I've got this thing in front of me that just told me I was a little bit too slow, and they go chasing that speed the next rep, and suddenly now instead of being underneath by 0.05 meters per second, they might be over speed by 0.05 meters per second or something. I know we have covered a lot of ground today, and I just want to reiterate, if you don't have VBT currently, but it is something that you have access to, it's within your budget, it is something you should consider adding to your repertoire. Is it going to solve all problems? No, absolutely not. I think we all know that extenuating circumstances and lifestyle factors absolutely can throw off training programs that are incredibly well written, even if VBT is included. But if you are truly maximizing things outside of the gym, having VBT at your disposal will 100% make you a more efficient programmer and coach and lifter. So if you aren't currently using it and you have the opportunity or the ability to go out and bring it into your home, bring it into your facility, please consider doing so. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. If you have questions, please do not hesitate to get down into the comments. And if you are looking for more content just like this, I'm gonna link a video right to my left, and I'll see you in the next one.